So, when you think about the evidence presented in the previous two videos, a lot of us have felt the effects of the curse of sin in our lives, relationships broken, covenants broken, any number of things that we have been affected by that have taken us away from having a life filled with love and light and wholeness. But going to Ezekiel 36, it talks about God's desire, His intent through the sacrifice of Jesus to live inside of us, to bring us to a whole relationship where we are back to the original plan before sin, back to the plan in the Garden of Eden where we were talking to Him face to face. And we didn't feel shame, and we didn't feel we had to hide or cover up anything. Okay, so I want to bring us back to talking about some of the earlier presentations on this series of surviving foundations for surviving the fellowship, and think about what I quoted about vows in the Old Testament, between vows that men and women made to take time, have some fasting, some prayer, have a covenant walk with God. Okay, and in the Old Testament, a male person in authority, could have not allowed a woman to make those kind of vows. He could have stood as a barrier between her and those vows. If he had initially allowed those vows but then later changed his mind, he bore a sin for that, because both were allowed to have that relationship. In the Old Testament, they were considered a nation of priests, men, women, and children. So this included everybody, okay? So in the New Covenant, it was said a little differently. So I want us to come back to that. I haven't pointed this out before. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks about his suggestions for a husband and wife if they wanted to set aside time for prayer and fasting, which often meant abstaining for a short period of time from intimate sexual relationships, normal intimate relationships. And it says, starting in verse 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. They were as an equal pair. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence. Benevolence is a word meaning love and kindness. And likewise also the wife unto the husband. They were supposed to both meet each other's needs. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Now in the Old Testament, because of curse, because of sin, there were a lot of times when a woman did not have the right over her own body. But in the New Covenant, coming to unity in Jesus, coming to a relationship with Him, coming to healing, even Paul talked about how they both had rights over each other's body. They were both equal in this area. So I'm not pointing this out to focus on the issue of men and women and all the issues that people polarize on this, but I'm pointing this out to point out that both men and women also, figuratively, spiritually, are equal in their relationship with God, and we're called to have a covenant with Him. And when you think about everything that's been pointed out in this video and the last couple of videos, we're talking about worship. We're talking about individual rights to have a covenant with God, a personal covenant with prayer. Many of the forces that are now coming to play with unifying, all the different churches are not supporting this. Instead, they want it to be something that is an authority, a religious authority has power over. We have power to come to Jesus by ourselves in prayer and have a relationship with him. So this brings me to one of the last texts I'm going to point out that also is about covenant. And we usually don't think about this, but if you weave all these texts together and you realize and you let the Bible explain itself, it's really talking about this, okay? In Habakkuk chapter 2, read verse 1, but also I'm going to start reading in verse 2. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall stand and not. At the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. So this was a covenant involving the tables. This was a covenant involving the prophecy charts. The 1843 chart especially, but also the 1850 chart. So this is in the Bible. This is a text that the Millerites recognize as applying to the prophecy charts. And so part of coming to the foundations that help us survive the fellowship and survive the world we live in involves coming back to studying these charts as well as the whole Bible. The whole Bible is a prophecy for us. So let's go to verse 4 of Habakkuk 2. Behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. This was a text that came to Martin Luther as he began the Protestant Reformation, as he began to be fully converted about righteousness by faith. So, when you consider all the things that I've been pointing out in these videos, we need to come back to these foundations. So, I'm going to come to some later videos that some of them have already been produced, but I need to, add a few things that talk about righteousness by faith, that talk about the foundations with that talk about 1888, some things that happened there, and bring us back to the book of Joel. The book of Joel is a book for our time, okay? So study these things. These are about our relationship, our covenant with Jesus. That includes prophecy, includes understanding these things in a way that's going to keep us from polarizing on either side of either issue, but help us to stay focused. And I'm going to point out also that we're going to be studying what happens with prophets and prophecy. So I intend to bring us back to looking at what happened in the anointing of Jehu in the Old Testament, what happened in the time of Christ, what happened in the Millerite time, and what happened for us with the book of Joel. Okay? I want to point out that in the time of Christ, as you read the four Gospels, he experienced these four things. He experienced opposition. They called him demon-possessed. He was fiercely and viciously opposed. They did not recognize the prophecies applying to him. The religious leaders organized against him when they should have recognized him from their own prophecies. There was a shaking that the people went through with this. And there are things that happened with the disciples, especially when you think about how they argued about who was the greatest, some of the things that happened there. So as we study these things and we become aware of how God has worked during these time periods, we understand that even though we see some of these things happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that something's not true. When we see the external polarization and fault finding, it shows us that actually we are very close to the time when these things will be fulfilled. So I'm going to close, and there's a video after this by David Gates, a very brief video that I think also explains what's happening in our time. Thank you.